In November 1907, an Australian judge decided that a working man needed 7 shillings a day. Not what his employer could afford. What he needed to keep a wife and 3 children fed and housed. That number became the floor under every wage in this country for the next 60 years, and it is the reason there is a minimum wage in Australia today. It did not come out of a parliament. It came out of a single factory on the western edge of Melbourne, in a case the factory's own owner brought and lost. The man's name was Hugh Victor McKay. He made harvesters, and the town around his works was renamed after one of his machines. That factory closed in 1986 and was demolished in 1992. The town is still there. This is the story of what one company built, what it broke, and what it left standing. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Junction. Before there was a factory, and long before there was a town called Sunshine, there was a crossing. The country west of Melbourne is a flat volcanic plain, black soil over basalt, cut by creeks that run hard in winter and disappear in summer. It is Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation, held for tens of thousands of years by the Kurung Jungbaluk and Marin Baluk clans, who knew every waterhole on it. The Europeans who came in the 1830s and 40s saw grazing land and quarried bluestone. Then came the railways. In the 1880s, 2 lines crossed out there on the plain, the line running west to Ballarat and the line running north to Bendigo. And where they met, the Victorian Railways put in a station. There was no town. There was a station because there was a junction, and the junction needed a name, so they called it Braybrook Junction after the parish it sat in. What grew up around it was small and industrial, and not particularly hopeful. There were a few streets of houses. There was an ore treatment works. And from about 1889 and 1890, there was a factory called the Braybrook Implement Works, making agricultural machinery on the exact patch of ground this whole story happens on. That matters, and it is worth being clear about it, because the easy version of this story is that a great man arrived at an empty paddock and conjured a town out of nothing. He did not. There was already a settlement here, already a railway, already a factory making farm machinery on the site. What was missing was scale and money, and a reason for anyone outside the district to have ever heard the name. The Braybrook Implement Works struggled. Farm machinery in Victoria in the 1890s was a graveyard trade, with the Depression still working its way through the colony, dozens of small makers competing on credit terms with farmers who could not pay until the harvest came in, and often could not pay then either. Half the implement makers in the colony went under. There was a reason a factory had gone up there at all. The junction meant you could bring pig iron and coal in by rail, and send finished machines out by rail in 3 directions without touching a road. And land on the basalt plain was cheap because almost nothing would grow on it. It was a good place to put something heavy. It was not, in 1890, a good place to live. There was no made road worth the name, no gas, no proper water supply, and a few hundred people at most of them working either on the railway or at the works. And in 1904, a man from Ballarat bought it. Within 3 years, the town had a different name. Chapter 2. The boy at Drumatine Hugh Victor McKay was born at Raywood in central Victoria on the 21st of August, 1865, the 5th of 12 children of Nathaniel and Mary McKay, Irish Free Church of Scotland selectors who had come out to farm the Bendigo country. The family moved to a block at Drumarton while he was small. He had almost no schooling worth the name. He was, at 18, a farm boy with a blacksmith's hands and no prospects except his father's paddocks. In October 1883, he read a newspaper article. It was in the Melbourne Leader, written by J. L. Dow, describing combined harvesting machines being used in California. The problem it described was the problem every wheat farmer in Australia had. Harvesting took 3 separate operations: stripping the heads, threshing the grain, then winnowing and bagging it. And it took men and time and money at exactly the moment of the year when you had none of any of them. McKay went out to his father's blacksmith shop, a slab hut with a dirt floor, and started building. He worked on it with his brother John through 1884, out of scrap and bar iron and whatever the farm had. He finished it in January 1885. He patented it on the 24th of March that year under the title Improvements in and Connected with Harvesting Machines. What he had built took the standing crop and delivered bagged grain in a single pass across the paddock. Now, here is where the company's own story and the historical record part company, and it is better to say it plainly than to be corrected on it later. McKay did not invent the harvester. He did not invent the stripper either. A South Australian named John Ridley had built a working stripper back in 1843, 40 years before McKay was in that blacksmith shop. And a Victorian named James Morrow had perfected, patented, and publicly exhibited a stripper harvester more than a year before McKay finished his and beat him at the government trial in December 1884. The Australian Dictionary of Biography puts it bluntly that McKay's claim to have built the first machine was inflated by his own company's propaganda. What McKay actually did was harder and rarer than inventing it. He made it work reliably, he made it cheap, and he sold it to a continent. 12 machines in 1895, around 500 by 1901, over 1900 by the middle of the decade after that. That is a genuinely astonishing curve, and it is worth understanding what sat behind it. The Australian wheat belt was expanding faster than the labour to harvest it. Every farmer pushing out into the Mallee and the Wimmera and the South Australian scrub had the same arithmetic problem, which was that his crop ripened all at once, and he could not hire enough hands to get it off before the weather took it. A machine that did the work of a gang, driven by one man and a team of horses, did not need to be sold. It needed to be built and delivered and repaired, and McKay was better at all 3 than anyone else in the country. And then the whole thing collapsed and left him with £25. Chapter 3. The Town Named After a Machine. The depression of the 1890s took McKay's first company the way it took thousands of others. He had set up at Ballarat in 1890 as the McKay Harvesting Machinery Company. By 1892 and 1893, it was gone, and the man who had built the machine was left with £25 to his name. He bought his own assets back out of the wreckage and started again. And he renamed the machine. The improved harvester went out to the market as the Sunshine. The company's own account was that the name came from a sermon by the visiting American evangelist Thomas DeWitt Talmage on the power and the benefits of sunshine, which is a story the firm liked to tell about itself and which should be taken as exactly that. The name worked. So did the machine, which was steadily improved year on year, because that was the other thing McKay understood. A harvester that broke down in February on a property 4 days from the nearest town was worse than no harvester at all, and reputation in that trade was built on the machines that did not fail. Through the late 1890s and into the new century, McKay pushed it out of Victoria and then out of Australia altogether, into South Africa, into North Africa, into Argentina, where it sold under the name La Australiana. By the middle of 1904, he was the largest manufacturing exporter in the Commonwealth of Australia, from a works in Ballarat. And Ballarat was the problem. It was inland. It was a long way from a port, and every ton of pig iron in and every machine out had to move by rail before it moved by ship. So in 1904, he bought the failing Braybrook Implement Works at that railway junction west of Melbourne. And in 1906, he moved everything. Not a branch, not an outpost, the whole works, the plant and the machinery, and more than 200 men who packed up their families in Ballarat and followed him down. There was a second reason for the move, and it is not the one in the company histories. Victoria at the time was setting minimum wages trade by trade through wages boards. Before he committed to the site, McKay obtained an undertaking from the Premier, Thomas Bent, that a wages board determination would not be extended to Braybrook. He moved his factory, in part, to a place where the state had privately agreed not to set his wages. Then in 1907, a petition of about 100 residents went to the Shire Council asking that the town be renamed, and by July, the Railway Commissioners had agreed. Braybrook Junction became Sunshine. First a machine, then the works, then the town. That same year, the man whose harvester had given the town its name walked into a Melbourne courtroom to prove that he paid his men fairly. Chapter 4. 7 shillings a day. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to understand the bargain the young Commonwealth had just made with its manufacturers. Alfred Deakin's government called it the New Protection. The logic was simple and, for its time, radical. Australian manufacturers would be shielded from foreign competition by tariffs. In return, they would be required to pass the benefit on to their workers. The Excise Tariff Act of 1906 put a duty on locally made agricultural implements, £6 on a stripper harvester, and then exempted any manufacturer who could show he paid wages that were, in the words of the Act, fair and reasonable. Protection in exchange for fair wages. McKay, who had campaigned hard for tariffs against the American implement makers, applied for the exemption. The application went before Justice Henry Borneys Higgins, President of the Commonwealth Court of Conciliation and Arbitration. Higgins had 112 applications from Victorian manufacturers in front of him. He chose McKay's as the test case, and he said exactly why. The factory, he wrote, was one of the largest and had the greatest number and variety of employees, and because his application was to be keenly fought. The hearing ran 20 sitting days in Little Lonsdale Street, from the 7th of October to the 8th of November, 1907. And Higgins did something nobody expected. He did not confine himself to company books and wage schedules. He went through 11 working households, line by line, and he called the workers' wives to give evidence. His reason is on the record. No one, he said, can give better evidence as to the way the shoe pinches, if it does pinch, than the working man's wife. So the court heard from Kate Russell of Bay Street, Port Melbourne, who had 6 children, whose husband handed her £2.10 a week, and who said plainly that this is not enough to keep the family going. It heard from a blacksmith named William Keating, with a family of 7, who itemised his week for the court: 7 shillings for rent, 13 for groceries, 8 for meat, 3 for milk, 3 for bread, until the total came to slightly more than he earned. It heard from another blacksmith, Frederick Kent, who told the court there was no scope in his budget for amusements or liquors or savings, and who worked nights as a billiard marker to make up the difference. On the 8th of November 1907, Higgins delivered his judgment. A fair and reasonable wage, he ruled, could not be measured by what an employer chose to pay or could afford. It had to be measured against the normal needs of the average employee, regarded as a human being living in a civilised community. For an unskilled labourer, he set that figure at 7 shillings a day, 42 shillings a week. McKay was paying 6. He lost. And in the same judgment, Higgins called his works a marvel of enterprise, energy and pluck, and said that McKay had invented successful machines and produced them in great numbers in competition with the world. He then wrote that when a man chooses, in the course of his economies, to economise at the expense of human life, Parliament insists on the payment of the duty. 7 months later, the High Court handed McKay everything back. Chapter 5. Easter Monday. On the 26th of June 1908, in the case of Rex against Barger, the High Court of Australia struck down the Excise Tariff Act. The vote was 3-2. Chief Justice Griffith, with Barton and O'Connor, held that the Commonwealth could not use its taxation power to regulate wages and conditions, which were matters left to the states. Isaacs dissented. So did Higgins, sitting on the same bench that had just overturned the reasoning of his own judgment. The Act was dead. The excise was never collected, and the whole new protection bargain, tariffs traded for fair wages, collapsed with it. McKay never paid it, and he was never compelled to lift a single man's wage to 7 shillings. But the number did not die with the Act. It had been spoken by a judge, in a court, on the record, and it was taken up almost immediately as the standard against which Australian wages were measured. The Harvester Standard, they called it. Arbitration courts applied it. Unions bargained against it. It became the basic wage, and it remained the foundation of wage fixing in this country until the basic wage itself was abolished in 1967, 60 years later. McKay won the case and lost the century. The number outlived him, and 2 months before that High Court ruling, on the night the town was still getting used to its new name, Sunshine put itself on the front page of every newspaper in Australia for an entirely different reason. It was Easter Monday, the 20th of April 1908, just before 11 at night. The Ballarat train had stopped at Sunshine Station, packed with holiday travellers heading home to Melbourne, around 1,100 people aboard the 2 services that night. The Bendigo train came through behind it and did not stop. It ran through the signals and struck the stationary train from behind. 44 people were killed. 413 were injured, 72 of them seriously. Almost every death was on the Ballarat train because the Bendigo train had 2 locomotives on the front that absorbed the impact. It remains the worst railway disaster in the history of Victoria. The cause was a signalling and braking failure on the Victorian railways. It had nothing whatever to do with the Harvester Works, and nobody at the time suggested otherwise. But 4 of the dead were McKay's men. Albert Ellingson was the only victim who actually lived in Sunshine, and he worked at the Harvester Works. 3 more of McKay's employees died who lived outside the district: John Thompson Brown of Ballarat East, and Leslie Russell Gates, Joseph Richard Gates and James Victor Pascoe, all 3 of Footscray. The dead were laid out at Spencer Street. The Premier, Thomas Bent, the same man who had quietly promised McKay that the wages boards would not reach Braybrook, ordered an inquiry. The 2 engine drivers were charged with manslaughter. It is still, more than a century later, the worst thing that has ever happened on a Victorian railway line. And it happened at a station that had carried its name for less than 12 months. And a town that had held its new name for less than a year had it printed in every newspaper in the country, attached to the worst thing that had ever happened on the Victorian railways. The word sunshine, chosen for a harvester and adopted by 100 residents who wanted something brighter than Braybrook Junction, now sat above column after column of casualty T-lists. There is a plaque on Platform 1 at Sunshine Station today, listing the 44. 3 years later, McKay locked the gates on his own workforce. Chapter 6. If the Men Go Out. On the 16th of February, 1911. The Agricultural Implement Makers Union went on strike at Sunshine. The issue was the closed shop. The union's demand that every man in the works be a member. McKay's response was not to negotiate with the strikers. It was to lock out every unionist in the factory, whether they had struck or not. He said so publicly in the Argus on the record, and it is the clearest single sentence anyone ever got out of him. If the men go out tomorrow, he said, they do so to please themselves, and they will not come back again until it pleases me, even if it takes a week or 6 weeks or a year. The Prime Minister of Australia, Andrew Fisher, wrote to him offering to mediate. McKay refused. The lockout ran 13 weeks, from February to the middle of May. It was the longest industrial dispute Victoria had seen. Around 2,500 workers at Sunshine were affected, and counting families, perhaps 10,000 people. The lost wages ran to something like £54,000. Office staff were photographed unloading coal to keep parts of the plant moving. The men went back on McKay's terms. The union was broken, financially ruined, and effectively inactive for the next 14 years. The union secretary through it was Edward Russell, whose wife Kate had given evidence in Higgins's court 4 years earlier about feeding 6 children on £2.10 a week. Its president was J.G. Skehan. They had gone into February 1911 with a national dispute and a Prime Minister willing to help them, and they came out of May with nothing, and no organisation left to try again. And here is the part that explains why he could do it. A great many of the men walking back through those gates were walking back to houses they were buying from the company, on rent purchase terms, on land McKay had subdivided. He had built them a town, and the town was leverage. He was explicit about the theory, if not about that particular application of it. The family's stated philosophy was that a married man, preoccupied with his family, his mortgage repayments and his garden, made a loyal, diligent and politically moderate workman, and would be poor material for what they called socialist and communist designs. The labour organiser Tom Mann had a shorter description of him. He called McKay a free trader in humans. There is no way to reconcile the two halves of this man, and it is a mistake to try. The same year he was locking 2,500 men out of his works. He was extending the gardens they walked past on the way home. And yet, by every standard of the time, the town McKay built around that factory was a genuinely good place to live, and better than almost anywhere else a factory hand could raise a family in Australia. Chapter 7. The Whistle. Start with the sound, because everyone who lived there started with the sound. There was a steam whistle on top of the bulk store at the harvester works, and it did not simply mark the start and end of a shift. It ran the day. 6:30 in the morning was the warning. 7:15, 7:30 and you were at your bench. Noon for lunch, 12:25 to get back, 5 o'clock to go home. It could be heard from the far edge of the housing estate, over the shunting in the yards and the noise of the works itself. Nobody in that town needed an alarm clock, and for 2 generations, nobody in that town used one. Around it, McKay built the rest. In 1909, he laid out the Sunshine Gardens, 8 acres designed by F.A. Horsfall, an assistant city engineer from Ballarat, deliberately sited facing the works and the railway line, so that men could walk out at lunch and sit in them. They survive today as the H.V. McKay. Memorial Gardens, heritage listed, the oldest surviving industrial garden in Australia. In 1913, the Sunshine Technical School was built on land he donated, and half its students were his own apprentices. There was a church, a hall, a free library, a coffee palace, sports grounds. There was a pipe band formed in 1909, which is still playing today. There were 400 acres of housing sold to workers on terms. They called the place the Birmingham of Australia, and they meant it as a compliment. For a working family arriving from Ballarat or from the city, it was a real offer. Steady work, a garden, a school for the children, a house you could eventually own. None of it was accidental, and none of it was quite as generous as it looked. The gardens, the school, the church, the terms on the housing, all of it was aimed at producing a particular kind of workman, and the family said so. The Australian Dictionary of Biography reads the model town as an investment in industrial peace, and the arithmetic is not subtle. A man with a mortgage and a vegetable patch and children at the technical school is a man who thinks very carefully before he walks out the gate. If you had walked down Hampshire Road on a Saturday evening in 1925, this is what you would have found. The clock tower is new, up above the showroom on Devonshire Road, and you can read it from most of the town. The works themselves run to about 30 acres of buildings on a site of around 76, the largest manufacturing plant in Australia, and what the company itself claimed was the largest implement works in the Southern Hemisphere. There is coal smoke and hot metal in the air, even on a Saturday, because the furnaces never fully go out. Trains come through the junction every few minutes out to Ballarat, up to Bendigo, back into the city. Families are out on the footpath, men who spent the week in the foundry, now in clean shirts, children running ahead. The gardens across the line are full. Somewhere the pipe band is playing because the pipe band is always playing. And every single person on that street knows exactly what time it is because they have spent their whole lives listening to one whistle. By 1926, the works employed around 2,500 people, and in that year alone, it paid out £600,000 in wages and salaries. On the 15th of May, 1926, McKay laid the foundation stone of the memorial church at Sunshine. 6 days later, he was dead, at Rupertswood at Sunbury. He was 60. His estate was valued at £1,448,146 out of a business he had built by fighting in the highest court in the country to keep paying his labourers 6 shillings a day. 13 years after they buried him, the factory he built to make harvesters started making shells. Chapter 8. The Annex. The works had gone to war once before. Through the First World War, Sunshine turned out ambulances, general service wagons, water carts, trenching tools, horseshoes, hand grenades. In one 4-week stretch, it delivered 200 wagons, 23 ambulances and 150 water carts to the Australian forces. A man named Howard Thompson, known as Bushy, who worked there in those years, recalled to the company's own magazine that they worked from 6:30 in the morning until 11:30 at night, and that McKay and his brother George would ride through the works on horseback. But the Second World War changed the place more completely. The Commonwealth built a gun munitions annex inside the harvester factory. The plant went to 24 hours a day. It turned out millions of spare parts for guns, rifles, tanks, marine and aircraft engines. The British government ordered 400,000 shell bodies, and Sunshine made them. At the same time, the works shipped 20,000 Sunshine drills, harrows, cultivators and binders to Britain to help a country under blockade grow its own food. And for the first time in real numbers, women came onto the factory floor, into the annex and the core shop and the bolt shop and the binder canvas shop, taking the benches of men who had enlisted. It was not quite the first time. Women had gone into the bolt shop as early as 1922, and it had caused an uproar at Trades Hall, with George McKay writing to the Argus to defend the practice. But 1939 was the year it stopped being an argument and became simply how the factory ran. In January 1942, they dug air raid shelters at the works. A major rail junction, a munitions annex, and the ordnance and explosives factories a few kilometres away at Maribyrnong made this square of Melbourne a genuine target. By January 1945, 659 of the firm's staff were in uniform. 32 of them were dead. One who came back was Lieutenant Jack Vance from the accounting department, who spent 3.5 years as a prisoner of the Japanese and walked back into his old office in 1946. And after the war, the town changed more than the factory did. Displaced persons came first, out of the wreckage of Europe. Then Maltese families, then Italians, and from the late 1970s, Vietnamese. They came because there was work in Melbourne's west, and they filled the streets McKay had subdivided, and they built the Sunshine that exists now. It is worth saying clearly, because this is the point where stories like this one usually go wrong. Those families did not cause what happened to the factory. They arrived to work in it, and many of them did. What happened to the factory was decided somewhere else entirely by people who never set foot in sunshine. Chapter 9. The Long Subtraction. The end took 30 years, and almost nobody living in sunshine could have told you the year it started. In 1930, in the teeth of the Depression, the firm merged with the Canadian company Massey Harris, becoming H.V. McKay, Massey Harris. The family still ran it. McKay's son Cecil became managing director in 1937 and chairman a decade later. Then in 1955, the McKay family sold its remaining interest. The business became Massey Harris Ferguson, and by 1958 it was simply Massey Ferguson Australia. The town was still called Sunshine. The factory in it no longer carried the name of the man who had named both. Between 1964 and 1969, the parent company spent £500,000 modernising the Sunshine plant. The works went into decline from 1969 anyway. That single fact is the answer to the question everyone asks about places like this. It was not neglect. £500,000 had just gone into the machinery. It was not the workforce either, because McKay had broken the union at Sunshine back in 1911, and it had never recovered its old strength. The problem was that the decisions had moved offshore. Core tractor and harvester production went to England. From 1971, the Sunshine plant was scaled down, and then the wall came down. On the 18th of July 1973, the Whitlam government cut tariffs across the board by 25%, and every government after it kept cutting. Between 1973 and 1980, 3,000 factories closed in Victoria. McKay had built the entire enterprise behind a tariff wall. He had campaigned for it. The new protection that put those tariffs up is the same policy that dragged him into Higgins's courtroom in 1907 and produced the 7-shilling wage. Protection made him, and the withdrawal of protection is what finished the place he made. At the same time, the parent company was collapsing globally, falling from something like 80,000 employees in the mid-1970s to under 20,000 by 1990. A plant on the other side of the world was an easy thing to close from a boardroom in Toronto or Coventry. And it should be said that Sunshine by then was not the one factory town it had been in 1907. Nettlefolds had come in making bolts and screws, Spalding's making sporting goods, Wunderlich making building materials, with ICI out at Deer Park and the Ordnance Works at Maribyrnong. The population had tripled after the war. The town had spent 40 years quietly diversifying out from under McKay's shadow, which is the only reason it survived what came next at all. And somewhere in the 1970s, under noise regulations, they took the whistle down. The factory was still running. The men still went in at 7:30. But the sound that had told an entire town when to get up, when to eat, and when to go home simply stopped, and people wrote in to complain, because for 2 generations it had been their alarm clock. Manufacturing at Sunshine ended in 1986, after about 80 years. The steel yard was demolished in 1988. In 1992, they knocked down the rest of it. Chapter 10. What stands today? They left the 1924 bulk store and the office buildings on the south side of Devonshire Road. Everything else came down. In 1994, Woolworths bought 2/3 of the site for $10 million. On the 11th of October, 1998, the Sunshine Marketplace opened on the ground where the factory floor had been. You can stand in the car park today, roughly where the foundry was. There is no marker on the ground to tell you what stood there, and most of the people pushing trolleys across it have no particular reason to know. So here is the honest accounting in numbers, because this is the part that usually gets told wrong. The company built the town and named it. The manufacturing died in 1986, and the buildings came down in 1992. But Sunshine, the suburb, did not die and never became a ghost town. About 10,000 people live in Sunshine itself, inside a city of Brimbank of nearly 195,000. More than half of Brimbank's residents were born overseas, and more than 160 languages are spoken there. It is also, genuinely, a disadvantaged place. On the standard measure of relative socio-economic disadvantage, Brimbank scores 912, against about 1,018 for Greater Melbourne. And it is being rebuilt. The junction that created the town in the first place is being turned into the Sunshine Super Hub, part of the Melbourne Airport Rail Project. Billions of dollars of Commonwealth and state money, under construction now and due around 2030, designed to run more than 1,000 train services a day through Sunshine. What survives of McKay is mostly civic. The H.V. McKay Memorial Gardens, still there, still heritage listed, still 8 acres of lawn and trees facing a railway line where a factory used to be. The clock tower, the factory gates, the railway footbridge the men crossed to get to work, the memorial church, whose foundation stone he laid 6 days before he died, the pipe band, formed in 1909, still playing, and a plaque on Platform 1 with 44 names on it. And the whistle survives too, not on a building. It is a museum object now in a collection in Melbourne, a piece of steel behind glass that once told several thousand people when to wake up, when to eat, and when to go home. The factory it sat on is a shopping centre and a car park. The town it used to wake is still there, waking now to the first trains through the junction. And the number that came out of that factory, 7 shillings a day, set by a judge against the wishes of the man who owned the place, outlived the harvester, the works, the family, the company name and the tariff wall. The whole thing was built behind. It is still, in a direct and traceable line, the reason there is a floor under wages in this country. He fought it all the way to the High Court, and he won. It is the only thing he built that is still standing everywhere.